Hello and welcome back to Story Time with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in Danny the Champion of the World, Danny and his father William had just caught 120 pheasants who had eaten the raisins with sleeping powder in them. And now they're about to take them home with the help of a taxi driver who is one of William's old friends. I wonder what's gonna happen to them now. Oh, about to find out. You ready? Alright. Let's begin. Chapter 17. The Taxi. 2 minutes later, we were safely inside the taxi and cruising slowly down the bumpy track towards the woods. My father was bursting with pride and excitement. He kept leaning forward and tapping Charlie Kinch on the shoulder and saying, "How about it, Charlie? How about this for a hole?" And Charlie kept glancing back pop-eyed at the huge bulging sacks. "Cripes, man," he kept saying. "How did you do it?" "Danny did it," my father said proudly. "My son Danny is the champion of the world." Hence the title of the story again. Then Charlie said, "I reckon pheasants is going to be a bit scarce up at Mr. Victor Hazel's opening day shoot tomorrow. Eh, William?" "I imagine there are, Charlie," my father said. "I imagine there are. All those fancy folk," Charlie said, "driving in from miles round in their big shiny cars, and there won't be a blinking bird anywhere for them to shoot." Charlie Kinch started chuckling and chortling so much he nearly drove off the track. "Dad," I said, "what on earth are you going to do with all these pheasants?" "Share them out among our friends," my father said. "There's a dozen of them for Charlie here to start with." "All right, Charlie." "Marvellous," Charlie said. "Terrific. Then there'll be a dozen for Doc Spencer and another for Enoch Samways." "You don't mean Sergeant Samways?" I gasped. "Of course," my father said. "Enoch Samways is one of my very oldest friends." "Enoch's a good boy," Charlie Kinch said. "He's a lovely lad." Sergeant Enoch Samways, as I knew very well, was the village policeman. He was a huge, rather plump man with a bristly black mustache who strode up and down our high street with the proud and measured tread of a man who knows he is in charge. The silver buttons of his uniform sparkled like diamonds, and the mere sight of him frightened me so much I used to cross over to the other side of the street whenever he approached. "Enoch Samways likes a piece of roasted pheasant as much as the next man," my father said. "I reckon he knows a thing or two about catching them as well," Charlie Kinch said. I was astounded, but I was also rather pleased because now that I knew that the great Sergeant Samways was human like the rest of us, perhaps I wouldn't be so scared of him in the future. "Are you going to share them out tonight, Dad?" I asked. "Not tonight, Danny. No. You must always walk home empty-handed after a poaching trip. You can never be sure Mr. Abbott's or one of his gang isn't waiting for you by the front door to see if you're carrying anything." "Oh, but he's a crafty one, that Mr. Rabbit is," Charlie Kinch said. "The best thing is to pour a pound of sugar in the gas tank of his car when he ain't looking. Then he can't ever come snooping up around your house later on. We always made sure to give the keepers a little sugar in their tanks before we went out on the poach. I'm surprised you didn't bother to do that, William, especially on a big job like this one." "What does the sugar do?" I asked. "Blimey, it gums up the whole ruddy works," Charlie Kinch said. "You've got to take the entire engine to pieces before it'll go again after it's had the sugar. Ain't that right, William?" "That's quite right, Charlie," my father said. We came off the bumpy track onto the main road, and Charlie Kinch got the old taxicab into top gear and headed for the village. "Are you dumping these birds at Mrs. Clipstone's place tonight?" he asked. "Yes," my father told him. "Drive straight to Mrs. Clipstone's." "What? Why Mrs. Clipstone's?" I asked. "What's she got to do with it?" "Mrs. Clipstone delivers everyone's pheasants," my father said. "Haven't I told you that?" No, Dad, you haven't, I said, aghast. I was now more stunned than ever. Mrs. Grace Clipstone was the wife of the Reverend Lionel Clipstone, the local vicar. Always choose a respectable woman to deliver your pheasants, my father announced. That's correct, Charlie, isn't it? Mrs. Clipstone's a right smart lady, Charlie said. I could hardly believe what they were saying. It was beginning to look as though just about everybody in the entire district was in on this poaching lark. The Victor's very fond of roasted pheasant for his dinner, my father said. Who isn't? Charlie Kinch said when he started chuckling to himself all over again. Well, I haven't. In all my life, I've never even tried pheasant. I'm starting to wonder what it might taste like. Anyways, we were driving through the village now. Street lights were lit and the men were wandering home from the pubs, all full of beer. I saw Mr. Snoddy, my headmaster, a bit wobbly on his feet and trying to let himself in secretly through the side door of his house. Oh, God. But what he didn't see was Mrs. Snoddy's sharp, frosty face sticking out of the upstairs window watching him. Oh, he's gonna get it big time. You know something, Danny? My father said. We've done these birds a great business putting them to sleep in this nice, painless way. They'd have had a nasty time of it tomorrow if we hadn't got to them first. Rotten shots most of them fellows are, Charlie Kinch said. At least half the birds finished up winged and wounded. The taxi turned left and swung in through the gates of the vicarage. There were no lights in the house and nobody met us. My father and I got out and dumped the pheasants in the coal shed at the rear. Then we said goodbye to Charlie Kinch and began to walk the 2 miles back to the filling station. Chapter 18. Home. Soon we had left the village behind us and we were in open country. There was no one else in sight. Just the 2 of us, my father and I, tired but happy, striding out along the curvy country road in the light of the moon. I can't believe it, my father kept saying. I simply cannot believe we pulled it off. My heart is still thumping, I said. So is mine, so is mine. But oh, Danny, he cried, laying a hand on my shoulder. Didn't we have a glorious time? We were walking right in the middle of a road as though it were a private driveway running through our country estate and that we were the lords of all we surveyed. Do you realize, Danny, my father said, that on this very night, on this Friday, the 30th of September, you and I have actually pegged 120 prime pheasants from Victor Hazel's wood? I'm still surprised and impressed. I looked at my father. His face was alight with happiness, and his arms were waving all over the place as he went prancing along the middle of the road with his funny iron foot going clink, clink, clink. Roasted pheasant, he cried out, addressing the moon and the entire countryside. The finest and most succulent dish on earth. I don't suppose you've ever eaten roasted pheasant, have you, Danny? Never, I said. You wait, he cried. You just wait till you taste it. It has an unbelievable flavour. It's sheer magic. Doesn't it have to be roasted, Dad? Of course it has to be roasted. You don't ever boil a young bird. Why do you ask that? I was wondering how we would do the roasting, I said. Don't you have to have an oven or something? Of course, he said. But we don't have an oven, Dad. All we've got is a kerosene burner. I know, he said, and that is why I have decided to buy an oven. Buy one, I cried. Yes, Danny, he said, with such a great and glorious stock of pheasants on our hands, it is important that we have the proper equipment. Therefore, we shall go back into the village tomorrow morning and we shall buy an electric oven. We can get one at Wheeler's, and we'll put it in the workshop. We've got plenty of electric plugs in the workshop. Won't it be very expensive? No expenses too great for roasted pheasant, my father announced superbly. And don't forget, Danny, before we put the bird in the oven, we have to lay strips of fat bacon across the breast to keep it nice and juicy. And bread sauce, too. We shall have to make bread sauce. You must never have roasted pheasant without lashings of bread sauce. There are 3 things you must always have with roasted pheasant: bread sauce, potato chips, and boiled parsnips. There was half a minute's silence as we both allowed ourselves the pleasure of dreaming about these beautiful foods. "And I'll tell you what else we've got to get," my father said. "We've got to get one of those deep freezers where you can store things for months and months and they never go rotten." "Dad," I said, "no. But don't you realize, Danny, that even after we've given birds away to all our friends, to Charlie Kinch, to the Reverend Clipstone, and Doc Spencer, and Enoch Samways, and all the rest of them, there'll still be about 50 left for us. That is why we are going to need a deep freezer." "But it'll cost the earth." "And worth every penny of it," he cried. "Just imagine, Danny, my boy, every time we fancy a nice roasted pheasant for our supper, all we got to do is open up the lid of the freezer and help ourselves. Kings and queens don't live any better than that." A barn owl flew across the road in front of us, its great white wings waving slowly in the moonlight. "Did your mom have an oven in the kitchen, Dad, when you were a boy?" I asked. "She had something better than an oven," he said. "It was called a cooker. It was a great big long black thing, and we used to stoke it up with coal and keep it going for 24 hours a day. It never went out. If we didn't have any coal, we used bits of wood." "Could you roast pheasants in it?" "You could roast anything in it, Danny. It was a lovely thing, that old cooker. It used to keep the whole house warm in the winter." "But you never had a cooker of your own, did you, Dad? You and Mum, when you got married? Or an oven?" "No," he said. "We couldn't afford things like that." "Then how did you roast your pheasants?" "Ah," he said, "that was quite a trick. We used to build a fire outside the caravan and roast them on a spit, the way the gypsies do." "What's a spit?" I asked. "It's just a long metal spike, and you can stick it through the pheasant and put it over the fire and keep turning it round. What you do is you push 2 forked sticks into the ground on either side of the fire and roast the spit on the forks." "Did it roast them well?" "Fairly well," he said, "but an oven would do it better. Listen, Danny, Mr. Wheeler has all sorts of marvellous ovens in his shop now. He's got one in there with so many dials and knobs on it, it looks like the cockpit of an airplane. Is that the one you want to buy, Dad?" "I don't know," he said. "We'll decide tomorrow." We kept walking, and soon we saw the filling station glimmering in the moonlight ahead of us. "Will Mr. Rabbits be waiting for us, do you think, Dad?" I asked. "If he is, you won't see him, Danny. They always hide and watch you from behind the hedge of a tree, and only come out if you are carrying a sack over your shoulder or in your pocket, or if your pocket is bulging with something suspicious. We are carrying nothing at all, so don't worry about it." Whether or not Mr. Rabbits was watching us as we entered the filling station and headed for the caravan, I do not know. We saw no sign of him. Inside the caravan, my father lit the kerosene lamp, and I lit the burner and put the kettle on to make us a cup of cocoa each. "That," my father said as we sat sipping our hot cocoa a few minutes later, "was the greatest time I ever had in my whole life." Chapter 19. Rockabye Baby. At 8:30 the next morning, my father went into the workshop and dialed Doc Spencer's number on the telephone. "Now listen, Doctor," he said. "If you could be here at the filling station in about half an hour, I think I might have a little surprise present for you." The doctor said something in reply, and my father replaced the receiver. At 9 o'clock, Doc Spencer arrived in his car. My father went over to him, and the two of them held a whisper conversation between the pumps. Suddenly the tiny doctor clasped his hands together and sprang up high in the air, hooting with laughter. "You don't mean it!" he cried. "It's not possible!" He rushed over to me and grasped my hand in his. "I do congratulate you, my dear boy," he cried, pumping my hand up and down so fiercely it nearly came off. "That's physically impossible." "What a triumph! What a miracle! What a victory! Now why on earth didn't I think of that method myself?" "You are a genius, sir. Hail to thee, dear Danny. You're the champion of the world." For the 3rd time, there's the title of the story. Here she comes, my father called out, pointing down the road. Here she comes, Doctor. Here who comes? The doctor said. Mrs. Clipstone. He spoke the name so proudly as though he were a commander referring to his bravest officer. The three of us stood together beside the pumps, looking down the road. Can't you see her? My father asked. Far away in the distance, I could just make out a small figure advancing towards us. What's she pushing, Dad? My father gave me a sly look. There's only one way of delivering pheasants safely, he said, and that's under a baby. Isn't that right, Doctor? Under a baby? Doc Spencer said. Of course, in a baby carriage with the baby on top. Fantastic, the doctor said. My old dad thought that one up many years ago, my father said, and it's never been known to fail yet. It's brilliant, Doc Spencer said. Only a brilliant mind could think of a thing like that. He was a brilliant man, my father said. Can't you see her now, Doctor? That'll be young Christopher Clipstone sitting up in the carriage. He's 1.5 years old. Lovely child. I birthed him, Dr. Spencer said. He weighed 8 pounds and 3 ounces. Pretty big baby. I could just make out the small head of a baby sitting high up in the carriage, which had its hood folded down. There's more than 100 pheasants under that little nipper, my father said happily. Just imagine it. You can't put 100 pheasants in a baby carriage, Doc Spencer said. Don't be ridiculous. You can if it's been especially made for the job, my father said. This one is built extra long and extra wide, and it's got an extra deep well underneath. Listen, you could push a cow around in there if you wanted to, let alone 100 pheasants and a baby. Did you make it yourself, Dad? I asked. More or less, Danny. You remember when I walked you to school and then went off to buy the raisins? The day before yesterday, I said. Yes, and after that I went straight on to the vicarage and converted their baby carriage into this special extra large poacher's model. It's a beauty, really it is. Wait till you see it. And Mrs. Clipstone says it pushes even easier than her ordinary one. She did a practice circuit with it in her backyard as soon as I finished it. Fantastic, the doctor said again. Absolutely fantastic. Normally, my father went on, an ordinary brought carriage is all you'd ever need. But then no one's ever had 100 pheasants to deliver before now. Where does the baby sit? The doctor asked. On top, of course, my father said. All you need is a sheet to cover them, and a baby sits on the sheet. A bunch of pheasants make a nice soft mattress for any child. I don't doubt it, the doctor said. You'll be having a very comfortable ride today, young Christopher, my father said. We stood beside the pumps waiting for Mrs. Clipstone to arrive. It was the 1st of October, one of those warm, windless autumn mornings with a darkening sky and a smell of thunder in the air. What was so marvelous about my father, I thought, was the way he always surprised you. It was impossible to be with him for long without being astounded and surprised by one thing or another. He was like a conjurer bringing things out of a hat. Right now was the carriage and the baby. In a few minutes it would be something else again. I felt sure of that. Right through the village, bowed his breast, my father said. Good for her. She seems in an awful hurry, Dad, I said. She's sort of half running. Don't you think she's sort of half running, Dr. Spencer? I imagine she's just a bit anxious to unload her cargo, my doctor said. The doctor said. My father squinted down the road at the approaching figure. She does appear to be going a bit quick, doesn't she? He said carefully. She's going very quick, I said. There was a pause. My father was beginning to stare very hard at the lady in the distance. Perhaps she doesn't want to be caught in the rain, he said. I'll bet that's exactly what it is. She thinks it's going to rain and she doesn't want the baby to get wet. She could put the hood up, I said. He didn't answer this. She's running, Doc Spencer cried. Look! It was true. Mrs. Clipstone had suddenly broken into a full sprint. My father stood very still staring at her, and in the silence that followed I fancied I could hear a baby screaming. What's the matter, Dad? He didn't reply. There's something wrong with the baby, Doc Spencer said. Listen. At this point, Mrs. Clipstone was about 200 yards away from us, but closing fast. Can you hear him now, Dad? Yes, I can hear him. He's yelling his head off, Doc Spencer said. The small, shrill voice in the distance was growing louder every second. Frantic, piercing, non-stop. He's having a fit, my father said. It's a good thing we've got a doctor handy. Doc Spencer didn't say anything. That's why she's running, Doctor, my father said. He's having a fit and she wants to get him in here quick and put him under a code faucet. Some noise, I said. If it isn't a fit, my father said, you can bet your life it's something like it. I doubt it's a fit, the doctor said. My father shifted his feet uneasily in the gravel of the driveway. There's 1,001 different things that keep happening every day to little babies like that, he said. You know that, don't you, Doctor? Of course, Doc Spencer said, every day. I knew a baby who once caught his fingers in the spokes of a carriage wheel, my father said. It cut them clean off. The doctor said, the doctor smiled. Whatever it is, my father said, I wish to heaven she'd stop running. It'll give the game away. A long truck loaded with bricks came up behind the baby carriage. The driver slowed down and poked his head out of the window to stare. Mrs. Clipstone ignored him and flew on. She was so close now I could see her mouth wide open, panting for breath. I noticed she was wearing white gloves on her hands, very prim and dainty, and there was a funny little white hat to match, perched right on top of her head like a mushroom. Suddenly out of the carriage, straight up into the air, flew an enormous pheasant. Aha! My father let out a cry of horror. The fool in the truck started roaring with laughter. The pheasant flapped around drunkenly for a few seconds, then it lost height and landed on the grass by the side of the road. Crikey! Doc Spencer cried. Look at that! A grocer's van came up behind the truck and began hooting to get by. Mrs. Clipstone kept on running. Then whoosh! A second pheasant flew up out of the carriage. Then a third and a fourth. Great Scott! Doc Spencer said. I know it's happening. It's the sleeping pills. They're wearing off. My father didn't say a word. Mrs. Clipstone covered the last 50 yards at a tremendous pace. She came swinging into the filling station with birds flying out of the carriage in all directions. What on earth's happening? She shrieked. She pulled up sharp against the first pump and seized the screaming infant in her arms, dragging him clear. With the weight of the child suddenly lifted away, a great cloud of pheasants rose up out of the gigantic baby carriage. There must have been well over 100 of them, for the whole sky above us was filled with huge brown birds clapping their wings. A sleeping pill doesn't last forever, Doc Spencer said, shaking his head softly. It always wears off by the next morning. The pheasants were too dopey to fly far. In a few seconds they came down again and settled themselves like a swarm of locusts all over the filling station. The place was covered with them. They sat wing to wing along the roof of the workshop, and about a dozen were clinging to the sill of the office window. Some had flown down onto the rack that held the bottles of lubricating oil, and others were sliding about on the hood of Doc Spencer's car. One cock with a fine tail was perched superbly on top of a gas pump, and quite a number, those that were too drunk to do anything else, simply squatted in the driveway at our feet, fluffing their feathers and blinking their small eyes. My father stayed remarkably calm, but not poor Mrs. Clipstone. They nearly pecked him to pieces, she was crying, clasping the screaming baby to her bosom. Take him into the caravan, Mrs. Clipstone, my father said. All these birds are making him nervous. And Danny, push that carriage into the workshop. Quick! Mrs. Clipstone disappeared into our caravan with the baby. I pushed the carriage into the workshop. Across the road, a line of cars had already started forming behind the truck and the grocery van. People were opening their doors and getting out and beginning to cross over to stare at the pheasants. Watch out, Dad, I said. Look who's here. To be continued.